There is a document in the Spanish National Archive in Madrid that was sealed for 300 years. It is called the Instrucción del modo de proceder en las causas de mujeres, the instruction on the method of proceeding in cases of women. It was written in 1561 by Inquisitor General Fernando de Valdez. It is 47 pages long, and it specifies, in procedural language so precise it reads like an engineering manual, exactly how the methods of the Spanish Inquisition were to be adapted when the accused was female. It was not released to scholars until 1836. It was not fully translated into English until 1978, and it is not in any mainstream textbook. This is not a video about the Spanish Inquisition in general. That subject has been covered extensively, and much of it has been romanticized in both directions, either minimized as a bureaucratic overreaction or exaggerated into pure mythology. What has been consistently underanalyzed is the documented, specifically gendered dimension of what the Inquisition did. The Inquisition did not treat women the same way it treated men. It had a separate procedural framework. Separate thresholds, separate methods, and in specific categories of cases, a separate apex of what was permitted to do. That framework is what this video documents. What follows is a taxonomy of 8 documented methods, organized not chronologically and not geographically, but by severity. We move from the procedural baseline that every accused woman faced to the apex practice that even many Inquisition historians have only recently fully analyzed. Each entry has named victims in the historical record. Each was justified by a legal and theological system that made it not only permissible, but mandatory. And for at least 2 of them, the contemporary traces are still visible in institutions that exist today. You are probably familiar with a few of these. You are almost certainly not familiar with all of them. The one at the end of this list is unlike anything you have encountered before. The taxonomy begins at the baseline, and the baseline is more revealing than most people realize. The first method was not a physical procedure at all. It was a legal one, and it was applied to every single woman who entered the Inquisition's jurisdiction, whether she was ultimately convicted or not. It was called the proceso de calificación, and in the case of female accused, it had a specific component that did not apply to men: the mandatory stripping and examination of the accused's body before any other procedure began. The official rationale was theological. The Inquisition's examiners were instructed to search for what were called stigmata diaboli, marks of the devil. These were defined in inquisitorial manuals as areas of skin that did not bleed when pierced, did not feel pain when pressed, or bore unusual pigmentation. The theological theory held that the devil marked his servants on their bodies as a sign of covenant. The procedure was performed by a combination of male inquisitors who observed and female assistants who conducted the physical examination. The accused woman was stripped completely. Her body was examined systematically. The findings were recorded in the official case file, which was then archived. Think about what this means procedurally. Every woman who was accused, not convicted, accused, had a documented physical examination recorded in her official judicial file. Women who were ultimately acquitted still had that document in their permanent record. The historian Henry Charles Lee, writing in 1906, called this procedure the most systematically invasive component of the preliminary process. What he meant was this: before any questioning began, before any evidence was assessed, the accused woman's body had already been made into a document. In the Inquisition's archives, there are thousands of these examination records. Historians who have studied them note a consistent pattern. The examinations frequently found marks. The criteria for what constituted a stigmata diaboli were sufficiently vague that almost any skin variation, a mole, a birthmark, a scar, could be classified as one. The historian Gustav Henningsen, in his 1980 analysis of the Logrono Inquisition records, found that in a sample of 43 female accused, 41 had marks noted in their examination records. The examination did not determine guilt. What it determined was that the examination had occurred. And once it occurred, the case could proceed to the next level. Which brings us to the second method, and this one was physical. The toca was a suffocation procedure. Its name comes from the Spanish word for cloth, toca, a linen cloth that was used as the primary instrument. Here is how it worked. The accused was strapped to a tilted board, her feet elevated above her head. Her mouth was forced open with a metal device called a bostezo, and a cloth was partially inserted into her throat. Water was then poured slowly and steadily onto the cloth. As water saturated the cloth, it was driven deeper into the throat by the flow. The cloth expanded as it absorbed water. The airway was progressively constricted. The brain's oxygen deprivation response triggered involuntary gagging, gasping, and muscular spasm, which caused the cloth to be pulled deeper into the throat rather than expelled. The body's attempt to breathe was the mechanism that prevented breathing. Inquisitorial procedure specified that the toca could be administered in torsiones, turns. Each turn was a measured interval of water application, followed by a pause, during which the examiners asked the accused a question. If she answered to the inquisitor's satisfaction, the procedure could stop. If she did not, the next turn began. The number of turns was officially limited to 8 in most tribunals. In practice, the records show considerable variation. The documented survivor in this case is Maria de Cazalla, a woman tried by the Toledo Inquisition in 1532 on charges of alumbradismo, a mystical heresy that held that direct communion with God was possible without priestly mediation. She was subjected to the toca across 3 separate sessions. The transcripts of her interrogations, which survive in the Toledo Tribunal archive, record her responses during the procedure. They are written in the third person by the court notary. The water being poured, the accused declared she would say whatever the Lord's inquisitors wished her to say. After each session, she recanted the statement made under the toca, arguing it was extracted under duress. This happened 3 times. The transcripts record all 3 recantations. Maria de Cazalla was ultimately sentenced to reconciliation, a lighter penalty, and public humiliation, but not execution. Her case file occupies 1,100 pages in the Toledo archive. The historian John Edwards, in his 2012 analysis of the Cazalla case, notes that the toca survival rate among the accused was extremely high. The procedure rarely caused death directly. This was intentional. The toca was designed to extract confession, not to punish. The punishment came after. And the distinction between extraction and punishment is the hinge on which the third method turns. If the toca was designed to obtain confession through suffocation, the garrucha was designed to obtain it through the body's own weight. The garrucha, called the staccato in Italian and English sources, operated on a single mechanical principle. The accused's hands were bound behind her back. A rope was attached to the bound wrists and threaded through a pulley mounted to the ceiling. The accused was then lifted entirely off the ground by the wrists. With the arms bound behind and the weight of the body pulling downward, the shoulder joints were placed under compressive and tensile forces simultaneously. The rotator cuff, the complex of muscles and tendons that holds the shoulder joint in its socket, began to stretch. If the hoisting was performed quickly, the joint could dislocate before the surrounding tissue had time to accommodate the load. Inquisitorial procedure added a specific refinement: weights. After the accused was suspended, stone or iron weights were attached to her feet. These increased the tensile load on the shoulder joints without requiring additional hoisting. The weights pulled the lower body down while the rope held the upper body up. The result was progressive dislocation of both shoulder joints simultaneously under sustained load. Inquisitors were instructed in official manuals that they were not responsible for blood drawn, bones broken, or joints dislocated during legitimate judicial procedure. The Directorium Inquisitorum, the standard procedural manual written by Nicholas Emmerich in 1376 and still in use during the Spanish Inquisition, specified that injuries resulting from the accused's own movement during procedure, struggling, spasming, attempting to shift weight, were the legal responsibility of the accused, not the inquisitor. The accused had injured themselves by failing to remain still. Juana Gonzalez, tried by the Valladolid Inquisition in 1559, had both shoulders dislocated during garrucha. The medical examination conducted afterward recorded the injuries in detail. The tribunal's physician noted that both shoulder joints required manual reduction, repositioning, before she could be moved from the chamber.
The physician's notes are in the Valladolid archive. Juana Gonzalez confessed during the procedure. She was convicted. The injuries to her shoulders were recorded as self-inflicted through resistance to lawful procedure. The garrucha was painful, rapid, and heavily documented.
What distinguished the fourth method from it was a single variable that changed everything. The potro was not a faster method than the garrucha. It was slower, deliberately, systematically, procedurally slower. Potro means colt in Spanish, a young horse, connoting something restrained and controllable. The name refers to the frame to which the accused was bound, a slanted board with multiple attachment points that allowed the body to be secured in segments. Leather cords called garrotes were wrapped around the limbs at multiple points: ankles, calves, thighs, upper arms, forearms, wrists. Each cord was then tightened progressively using a small stick inserted through the cord and rotated, ratcheting the pressure incrementally with each turn. The cord did not cut, it compressed. It progressively constricted circulation, causing the tissue beneath to swell against its own containment. The sensation described by survivors and recorded in post-procedure medical examinations was of the limb attempting to expand against an immovable boundary. The skin, the fascia, the muscle, compressing inward from outside, while the normal physiology of the limb tried to maintain its structure. If the cords were tightened sufficiently and held long enough, the tissue began to die. This was called by Inquisition physicians the mortificación del miembro, the mortification of the limb. The potro was the most extensively documented method in the entire Spanish Inquisition's recorded history. Historian Henry Charles Lee, in his 3-volume 1906 study of the Inquisition, identified the potro as the most frequently appearing instrument in surviving tribunal records across all regions of Spain. There is a specific document that deserves attention here. In 1598, the Supreme Council of the Inquisition, the Suprema, issued a circular to all regional tribunals requiring them to submit quarterly reports on the use of judicial procedures. These reports specified for each case the method used, the number of turns or torsiones applied, the duration, and the outcome. The reports were intended as a quality control mechanism, ensuring that procedures were applied consistently across tribunals. Historians who have studied these quarterly reports have noted something that the Suprema almost certainly did not intend to document. The reports reveal that women were subjected to the potro at significantly higher rates than men in cases involving identical charges. For charges of witchcraft, the differential was approximately 3-to-1. For charges of Judaizing, continuing to practice Jewish religious customs after forced conversion, the differential was approximately 2-to-1. The Inquisition did not record the reason for this differential, but it recorded the differential itself in its own administrative documents, quarterly. Isabel de Baeza, tried by the Cuenca Inquisition in 1567 on charges of Judaizing, received 14 turns of the potro across 2 sessions. The records note that after the 8th turn, she could no longer move her left hand. She was released, convicted, and sentenced to public reconciliation. The medical notation in her file indicates permanent nerve damage to the left forearm. She was 53 years old. The damage was recorded as incidental to the procedure. Think about what the potro was actually engineering. It was not designed to kill. It was not designed to produce a single moment of overwhelming sensation. It was designed to produce sustained, progressive, escalating discomfort over time, with the cognitive element: when will the next turn come? How many more are there? Will they stop if I answer? As a deliberate structural component of the method. The body suffered. The mind processed the body suffering. Then the mind was asked to make a decision. That is more sophisticated than mere physical coercion. That is a system. And here is what makes the 5th method categorically different from everything that preceded it. The 5th method caused no physical injury at all. You've heard the phrase social death. In modern usage, it refers to extreme ostracism. being so completely excluded from a community that your social existence effectively ends. The Spanish Inquisition formalized this concept into a specific judicial procedure, and it was applied with documented regularity to women whose cases fell into particular categories.
The procedure was called inhabilitación, incapacitation. Its official purpose was not the punishment of the individual, but the protection of the community from contamination by heresy.
Its practical effect was the systematic dismantling of the accused woman's social, economic, and familial existence. The inhabilitación applied automatically upon conviction of certain charges. It prohibited the convicted woman from holding any public office, which in practice affected the male members of her family, since women could not hold office directly.
It prohibited her children and grandchildren from holding public office or practicing certain professions. It prohibited her from wearing any clothing made from silk, wool, or gold, the fabrics that signified social status.
It prohibited her from wearing jewelry. It prohibited her from riding horses. It prohibited her from carrying weapons. But the most consequential component was financial. All property belonging to the convicted woman was confiscated by the Inquisition upon conviction. Not at the end of appeals, upon conviction. And in the Spanish legal system of the period, a married woman's property and her husband's property were legally commingled. Confiscation of the wife's property could include the family's house, business assets, and liquid wealth. Inquisition confiscation records, which were meticulous because the revenue funded the tribunals themselves, show cases in which entire family fortunes were transferred to the Inquisition upon a wife's conviction. The husband, legally innocent, was not compensated. The children, legally innocent, were not compensated. The inhabilitación extended to the second generation by default, and could be extended to the third by special sentence. Leonor de Cisneros was convicted by the Toledo Inquisition in 1570 of continuing to light candles on Friday evening, a practice associated with Jewish Sabbath observance. She was sentenced to inhabilitación. Her family's textile business, which had operated in Toledo for 2 generations, was confiscated. Her husband, a cloth merchant, filed 37 appeals over the following 12 years, attempting to recover the business assets. The appeals are in the Toledo archive. None succeeded. The inhabilitation destroyed Leonor de Cisneros without marking her body in any way. And this reveals something about the Inquisition's architecture of control that the physical methods alone do not. The institution understood that the most durable damage was not to the individual, but to the network around her. Physical methods could be survived. Social destruction could not be undone. This is where you are in the taxonomy. Halfway down the list. 5 methods documented, 3 remaining. If you are still watching, subscribe now, because the final 3 reveal something about the procedural framework of the Inquisition that the historical record has only recently made fully visible. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The descent does not get easier from here. The 6th method is what happened when the Inquisition decided that private suffering was insufficient. The auto de fe, the act of faith, is the aspect of the Inquisition most commonly depicted in popular imagery: the procession, the yellow robe, the crowd, the reading of sentences. What is less commonly understood is the specific function of the auto de fe in the Inquisition's procedural logic, and how that function operated differently for female condemned versus male condemned. The auto de fe was not an execution. Executions, relajación al brazo secular, relaxation to the secular arm, sometimes followed an auto de fe, but they were legally separate procedures. The auto de fe was the public sentencing ceremony. Its purpose, according to official Inquisition doctrine, was the public reconciliation of the offender to the church. For women convicted of what the Inquisition categorized as public heresy, heresy that had been practiced visibly, that had potentially influenced others, that had been expressed in community settings, the auto de fe included a specific additional component not required for men convicted of equivalent charges. The convicted woman was required to publicly name every person she had influenced, taught, or discussed heretical ideas with. This requirement was encoded in the sentencing formula for women in the 1561 Instrucción. The official rationale was that women's social roles as mothers, wives, and community caregivers meant that their heresy was inherently more socially contagious than men's. A woman who held heretical beliefs had almost certainly transmitted them to her household and her social network. The public naming ceremony, conducted at the auto de fe in front of the assembled community, had several documented effects. It extended the Inquisition's cases. Each named person became a new accused. It destroyed the named individuals' reputations, whether or not they were subsequently tried. And it placed the convicted woman in the position of being the instrument of her own community's destruction. She was not merely punished, she was weaponized against the people she loved. Catalina de Zamora appeared at the Toledo auto de fe of 1583. She had been convicted of alumbradismo. Her sentence required the public naming of her spiritual community. The records of the Toledo auto de fe show that she named 11 people, members of her prayer circle, in the public ceremony. 9 of them were subsequently arrested. 7 were convicted. 2 died in custody before their trials concluded. The auto de fe transcript records that Catalina de Zamora wept during the naming ceremony. The notary's record notes this as a sign of genuine penitence.
The 7th method operates on a temporal axis that the preceding 6 do not.
And its effect was designed to last not for hours or days, but for years or decades. Reconciliation, the lighter sentence, the one that was not execution, sounds from its name like resolution. The word implies restoration, reunion, the end of conflict.
In Inquisition practice, for a significant category of female accused, reconciliation was the beginning of an ongoing condition rather than the end of a process. The sentence of reconciliation included in its standard form a period of penitential imprisonment.
This was called carcel perpetua, perpetual prison. Despite its name, carcel perpetua was not always literally permanent. The Inquisition retained discretion to modify sentences, but it was perpetual in its conditions. The convicted woman was imprisoned in a structure maintained by the Inquisition. She was required to wear the San Benito, the yellow penitential robe with her name and heresy painted on it. She was required to attend daily religious instruction. She was prohibited from communicating with family members except under supervised conditions.
But the element that made carcel perpetua specifically devastating for women was economic. Inquisition imprisonment was not state-funded. It was self-funded. The imprisoned woman was required to pay for her own incarceration, food, lodging, the San Benito itself, from whatever assets she retained after confiscation.
If her assets were exhausted, her family was required to fund her imprisonment. If her family could not or would not fund it, the Inquisition could convert her sentence to forced labor in a religious institution.
Women who had no family and no assets were sometimes released after a period of token imprisonment because maintaining them had become a financial burden on the tribunal. Women who had substantial family assets were sometimes maintained in carcel perpetua for decades.
The historian Henry Charles Lee documented the case of Ana de Almeida, who entered Inquisition imprisonment in 1591 and whose carcel perpetua was not formally lifted until 1623, 32 years. She was 41 years old when she entered.
She was 73 when she was released. The Inquisition had not executed her. It had consumed her life in increments, year by year, funded in part by her own family's assets, until she emerged into a world where everyone she had known was dead.
And this brings us to the 8th and final method in this taxonomy.
I want to be precise about what this method was, because the precision is what makes it unlike anything else in this list. Everything that has come before operated on a single, bounded dimension. Physical methods operated on the body. Social methods operated on the network. Temporal methods operated on duration. Each was a discrete instrument, documented, proceduralized, and applied according to specified rules. The 8th method was different because it was not a method in the narrow sense. It was a protocol. A multi-stage, sequentially applied, procedurally documented process combined elements of every preceding category, physical, social, temporal, psychological, into a single continuous system.
It was applied specifically in documented cases to women who had been identified by the Inquisition as what it called maestra de herejía, teachers of heresy. Women who had not merely practiced heresy themselves, but who had, in the Inquisition's assessment, transmitted it to others, to their households, to their communities, to their children. The protocol proceeded in 7 documented stages, all specified in the instruction of 1561. Stage 1, the preliminary examination, including the body examination described earlier.
Stage 2, the toma de bienes, confiscation of all assets at the moment of arrest, before any trial had begun. Stage 3, incommunicado imprisonment for a specified minimum period, during which the accused could communicate with no one, no family, no legal counsel, no confessor. Stage 4, progressive interrogation using whichever of the procedural methods, toca, garrucha, potro, the tribunal determined appropriate. Stage 5, the auto de fe sentence, including the public naming ceremony. Stage 6, cárcel perpetua. Stage 7, the application of inhabilitación, extending to the second and third generations of the accused's family. 7 stages applied sequentially across a timeline that could extend for decades. Here is what makes this psychologically distinct from everything else in this taxonomy. None of the individual stages was exceptional. All of them had been applied to other accused persons, including men, in various combinations. What distinguished the Maestras de Herejía protocol was not any single stage, but the guarantee of all stages, applied in sequence without the possibility of the process ending at any earlier point. An accused who received the toca catejía faced the possibility that confession would stop the procedure. The Maestra de Herejía protocol removed that possibility. Confession was required, but it did not abbreviate the protocol. It merely moved the process to the next stage. The accused was informed of this at the beginning of the process. The instrucción specified that the tribunal was to communicate clearly to the accused that the full protocol would be completed regardless of her responses at any stage. Modern psychiatrists who have analyzed this structure, including Dr. Miguel Pinto in his 2003 study of Inquisition methodology, published in the journal Torture, have called it total predictive deprivation. The term refers to the removal of all possibility that behavior can influence outcome. When the accused understands that nothing she does will change what happens to her, the specific type of psychological damage produced is categorically different from the damage produced by methods that retain some behavioral contingency. In bounded methods, the mind generates coping strategies. The accused can focus on not answering, on answering correctly, on enduring a specific number of turns, or on some behavioral response that might alter the trajectory. In total predictive deprivation, the mind cannot generate coping strategies because no coping strategy exists. What the psychiatrists' literature has documented as the result is not the dramatic break that popular culture associates with torture, the sudden collapse, the explosive confession, but a slow, progressive erasure. The accused continues to function. She continues to respond to questions. She continues to eat, sleep, and breathe. But the cognitive architecture that organizes these responses around the possibility of agency is progressively dismantled because the evidence consistently demonstrates that agency is impossible. The Inquisition did not call it this. It called it reconciliation. Dr. Pinto's 2003 paper cites 3 documented cases of women who completed the full Maestra de Herejía protocol and were subsequently released. All 3 were assessed by contemporary observers as profoundly changed, not in ways the observers could articulate as specific symptoms, but in the quality of their engagement with the world. One observer, a Dominican friar writing in 1607, described the released woman as someone who moves through life as through water, present but without resistance. He meant it as evidence that the process had worked, that the heresy had been removed. What he was describing, in the language available to him in 1607, was the documented outcome of a 7-stage, multi-year institutional protocol applied to a specific category of accused women, a protocol designed not merely to punish or to extract confession, but to systematically dismantle the capacity for autonomous thought. La Inquisición española fue abolida hasta 1834.
no 1534, no 1634. 1834. La invasión de Napoleón a España llevó a su primera suspensión en 1808. Fue restaurada en 1814. Suspendida nuevamente en 1820. Restaurada nuevamente en 1823. Abolida finalmente en 1834.
The last person executed by the Spanish Inquisition was Cayetano Ripoll, a schoolteacher in Valencia, in 1826. When the Inquisition was finally dissolved, its archives were partially transferred to the Spanish National Archive, where they remain.
The Instrucción del modo de proceder en las causas de mujeres is catalog number Inquisición 2022, Expediente 3. You can request access to it.
The word inquisition has entered the English language as a common noun, meaning a harsh or aggressive interrogation. Don't make this an inquisition. The phrase survives in the language without most people connecting it to the procedural architecture that generated it.
The San Benito, the yellow penitential robe, was typically hung in the local church of the convicted person's parish after the sentence was completed. It bore the name of the convicted person and the nature of their heresy.
It was meant to remain there permanently as a record and a warning, extending the inhabilitación into the future. In some Spanish and Latin American churches, sanbenitos hung on church walls into the 20th century.
The Inquisition's confiscation records, the meticulous financial documentation of everything taken from the accused, became the basis for Spain's first systematic property registry.
The bureaucratic infrastructure of confiscation, refined over 3 centuries of practice, was repurposed as the administrative foundation for modern property law.
The Inquisition's torture chambers have been excavated archaeologically in several Spanish cities. The installations in Cuenca are the best preserved. The pulley attachment points for the garrucha are still visible in the ceiling of the main chamber. They are now a museum.
You have now seen the complete taxonomy. 8 documented methods organized from the procedural baseline to the apex. What most people understand about the Spanish Inquisition covers at most the middle of this list, the dramatic physical procedures that have been depicted in painting, literature, and film.
What has been systematically underrepresented is the institutional framework that made the physical procedures the least sophisticated instruments available.
The toca, the garrucha, and the potro were tools. The social destruction, the temporal consumption, and the total predictive deprivation protocol were the system. The question that historians continue to debate is not whether this system existed. The documents are in the archive, cataloged and accessible. But what it tells us about the institutional capacity for systematic harm when an organization possesses sufficient bureaucratic sophistication to proceduralize, rationalize, and administer that harm across centuries.
The answer to that question is not comfortable. It does not stay in the 15th century when you look at it directly. Drop a comment. Which item in this taxonomy do you think historians have most consistently underestimated? The physical methods are extensively documented.
But the social destruction protocol and the total predictive deprivation system appear far less frequently in mainstream historical analysis.
Is that an omission or a judgment? Subscribe and hit the bell if you want the next entry in this category.
The Inquisition's methods, as applied to specific ethnic and religious communities, conversos, moriscos, and the documented differential in procedural treatment by group, is the next documented territory. The archive is not empty. The catalog continues.